Good, I think. So today's lecture is on the joyless victors. Doesn't that sound fun? The guys who win World War I, but they don't get a lot out of it, or they're not really enjoying it very much. They just seem to be continuing on with the problems from the late 19th century and just rolling forward into the 20th century. So we'll talk about Britain and France. You won't hear me say this very often at this period of time. If I go back to Louis XIV, you'll hear me say this. France had the best army in Europe. But then after Napoleon, let's say, not so much anymore. At this point in time, after World War I, France has the best army in Europe because they don't demobilize everything after World War I. Does that make sense? I mean, they have this existential threat to them. Where was World War I fought on the Western Front? In France. This is the Germans occupying France. And so they're obsessed with weakening Germany, just like they were obsessed with revenge against Germany before World War I. They've defeated them with friends in World War I. They want to keep that going. They want to weaken Germany, in fact. They want to enforce the Treaty of Versailles, all of its really harsh bits and pieces against the Germans. They want to keep that going. And quite frankly, northeastern France, where the war was fought, is really damaged. It was damaged then. Heck, it's still damaged today. Like I said, there's places in the northeastern part of France where you can't drink the water because it's all polluted with all of the junk that leached into the water table after the war. Reparations were needed. They wanted to fix all of that. They wanted to fix the human damage as well. You know, you've got all these kids who are orphans, or you have all of these widows, and they wanted the people who started the war. I'm doing this in air quotes. The people who started the war, the people who were responsible for the war, need to pay for it, and that's the Germans. Still, though, there's a left-right split. Remember how that was pre-war stuff? The left-right split with the Boulanger affair and the Dreyfus affair, that's still going on. Happily for France, the Great Depression doesn't affect them very much. France's economy is not a huge export economy. America was an export economy. The Germans had an export economy. The French have a pretty big internal market that they try to keep satisfied with goods and services. It is pretty self-sufficient in terms of agriculture. And it doesn't have, quite as much per capita industrialization as Germany or Britain or the United States. So in a way, the more agricultural you are during the Great Depression, the better off you are. They get about 1 million unemployed people. That doesn't seem terrible. And then they don't really care too much, and they don't really react very much to this crash in the economy. What does happen, though, that affects them is in 1931, there's a recognition that reparation payments are impossible during the Great Depression. The Great Depression starts, actually, do you know? I'll bet some of you know. When does the Great Depression sort of officially start for us? 1929. The stock market crashes in the fall of 1929, and then it just rolls on, probably really up until about World War II. So there's a moratorium or a stop in reparations payments. The Germans are like, yay! And everyone else is kind of like, that's not so good. In terms of foreign relations, you might remember that the French occupied the Ruhr Industrial Valley. From 1923, that's when the hyperinflation happened to the Weimar Republic, when the workers weren't working anymore. The French are hanging out there trying to squeeze blood from a turnip. I think that's what we say. In other words, trying to get industrial products from the Ruhr Industrial Valley that are owed to the French for reparations by actually being there. It's really pretty annoying for the Germans to have French on their soil doing this. As you know, it's nice that I get to mention this again. There's this Dawes plan. The Germans borrow money from the Americans. The Americans turn that money over to the French and British. The French and British pay us back for what we sold to them in the war. There's also this Locarno Treaty again. This is sort of that spirit of Locarno. And then the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. Both of those things together are all about peace, never again war. I renounce war as a means of, solving international problems kind of stuff. It sounds really pretty idealistic, doesn't it? And it doesn't last very long. It's really kind of ridiculous. There's seething tensions that are just going to blow those things up very quickly. There are new alliances that they're making. They're making an alliance with, what is CZ? Czechoslovakia and Romania and good. All these Eastern European states, they're supposed to take the place of Russia. Russia before World War I as an ally, threatened the Germans in a two-front war. Well, they aren't quite the same as a giant Russia. They also create this either brilliant or idiotic thing called the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is a series of gigantic fortifications that run along the German-French border. They've got everything that you can possibly imagine. It's like a Disney World of fortifications. Barracks and hospitals and cafeterias and little electric cars or electric trains that can drive troops from one point to another. Turrets, air filtration systems. It's this fantastic kind of fortification that should be able to defend the French border absolutely with concrete, reinforced steel pillboxes and so on, artillery pieces, machine gun emplacements, you name it. It's beautiful and perfect if you're fighting World War I again. But they don't, apparently. The idea here is this is cheaper than, this is super expensive. Imagine that, concrete, underground, all this stuff. But it's cheaper than doing what everybody nowadays does. You know how military equipment becomes obsolete over time? You have to buy new planes, and you have to buy new rockets, and new guns, and it's constant, right? You spend crazy amounts of money on your military. You build this once, spend crazy amount of money on this, and then it's just there. You don't have to constantly renew everything. So this seems like a brilliant or stupid idea. Here's the stupid bit, maybe. See how the fortification runs along the Franco-German border? And then see how they just stop right around the country of Belgica. In other words, what country is that in English? Belgium. See how they don't continue the Maginot Line up on the other side of Belgium? So this is either brilliant or stupid. It's obviously stupid, right? Because what did the Germans do in World War I? What are they going to do in World War II? Go through Belgium. Why is it brilliant? Why did the French kind of want the Germans to go through Belgium?
Because then they know where they're going to come from?
Yeah, partially.
Then they piss off the Brits.
It's like a buffer before they're like in France.
Yeah. At home? What was common at home?
I said they pissed off the Brits if they do that.
Yes, they're going to get Britain to join a world war. It happened in World War I. It happens, well, it doesn't happen in World War II. There's a different thing going on. But they figure if the Germans invade Belgium first, the Brits will be there to back them up, which is what they want. They don't want to fight the Germans by themselves. The Maginot Line doesn't work, obviously, because like we just determined, the Germans go right through Belgium.
Is it still functional?
It is not functional, but it is still there. You can go and you can visit it as a tourist. I desperately want to do that someday. I probably should have done last time, but I concentrated. Class trip, Maginot Line, let's go do it. We'll all wear berets. It'll be fun. 1936. Okay, so the Great Depression is going, it's not horrible. There's a left-right divide going on, obviously, in France still. And in 1936, all the left-leaning parties came together to sort of decide to create a government together. This is called the Popular Front government. And the reason why they come together, why they coalesce together, is because the people on the right, the far right, the nationalists, the anti-Semites, are starting to coalesce together. Right across the border is fascist Germany and fascist Italy. Nazi Germany, fascist Italy. The left in France is getting worried about right-wing movements in terms of foreign countries and right-wing movements inside of France. And so they unite. Stalin, we'll talk more about Stalin, is the dictator of the Soviet Union, says to the communists of France, you guys should, for the first time, work with other left-leaning people to be in the government together and run the government of France. There it is. We can see the PCF, the SFIO, the radicals at various lefts, all coalescing together to run the government. Well, this left-leaning government then tried to improve the lives of the working class. My mind is blown. They tried to do things for the people who voted for them. That's very normal. They wanted to do things for the working class, for the left-leaning people. And so they nationalized, bought away from the capitalists, the armaments industries and aviation industries. They nationalized them. The government is going to run those things because I think they thought it was wrong for capitalists to make money off of defending France. Does that make sense? They also instituted nice things like a 40-hour work week and paid vacations and collective bargaining with unions. Unions, that's a way of improving the lives of the workers. They put the Bank of France, once again, capitalist-owned Bank of France, they put under the control of the government. Trying in some way to reward the people who are voting for them, make the lives of the left-leaning people better, and people started to join unions in droves. They're like, oh, collective bargaining? Our representatives can negotiate with the owner class and we can get all kinds of things from them. People joined unions in droves. They also fixed the price of agricultural goods so that people would have, the farmers would have a minimum wage, so to speak, and that the price of wheat and so on wouldn't be too high. Mostly the problem is too much wheat, actually, at this point in time. So they're buying up the wheat, they're buying up the milk, they're buying up all the surplus so that the price stays high. And the right wing looks at this and says, socialism, horrible, horrible socialism. Does all that make sense? France retained its colonies in Africa and Asia after World War I. They won World War I. Why would they give up their colonies? They also got some extras. They got bits and pieces of the old Ottoman Empire. This is something that's called the mandate system. The League of Nations says, oh, these Middle Eastern people aren't able to govern themselves. Let's turn them over to a colonial power like France or Britain. It looks pretty good. Aren't you kind of impressed? You should be impressed with France. I think those are Pacific Islands there, that blue blob, like Tahiti, Polynesia. Oh no, I think France is pretty impressive for France. I'm done with France. Do you have any questions about France? Danielle?
Given that there was a red scare going on, how was the left allowed to do so many things that were seen as government control of?
Well, like I said, it scares the heck out of anybody who is conservative or really right-wing. There is, though, a really robust communist movement in France for a long period of time. There are a lot of people who, I think it goes back to the French Revolution, who want, worker unity, who want revolution, who want the working class to have a fair shake. And so there's probably 15% or so of French people who are voting communist. The problem is communism is under the control of the Soviet Union at this point in time, so you're basically, listening to an insane dictator, Stalin. Some people love communism, some people love left-leaning stuff, and then all the right-wing people are just, you can imagine, scared to death of these communists, socialists, and left-leaning Republican liberals. Britain is still a great power, but it's declining, I think, in relation to others. It's slipping a little bit. Within Britain, they pulled together to win the war. And there was kind of this thought that before the war, there's a lot of problems with Irish people, there's problems with labor versus capitalists and so on. Not to the point where they like communism. Brits just don't really go into communism. But they thought, hey, if we fight this war together, if everybody's sacrificing on the home front and the battle front, that when the war's over, things are going to be different. The normal people are going to get a fair shake. The normal people are going to come home and they're going to create a Britain which is fit for heroes. Heroes of World War I, home front and battle front. And that doesn't really happen. People go back to work and their regular jobs, the ladies get kicked out of the factories, men go back into the factories, and then what? It's the same old, same old. There's no social welfare state. There's no, super rich people are still super rich, and the working class are still the working class, and everybody's just serving them. They try to change that in 1926. There is a bunch of labor unrest in the coal industry. Does that sound familiar to you, Britain and coal? And the coal miners go on strike en masse, and other people in other industries, union people, support that. There's an attempt at a general strike in 1926. 6 million people, by the way, this is all pre-Great Depression. 6 million united workers go on strike, trying to force the capitalists to turn over power to them or to try to change things radically. It fails. The government steps in, has soldiers go into the mines, pull the coal out. Guys on the docks are replaced by soldiers and so on. And middle-class people step up to replace the workers. It fails. Worker unity, part of our thesis, right? It doesn't work so much in 1926. But once again, it scares the hell out of the capitalists. It scares the hell out of people who are conservative and on the right, saying, oh my gosh, the workers can get together and do this kind of thing. That's very frightening. Once again, there's not too much change from the 19th century. There's a conservative party, there's a liberal party, there are elections that happen. Sometimes the conservatives win, sometimes the liberals win. But here's the up and coming Labor Party. The working man's party, not communist, barely socialist. And labor is increasing at the expense of the liberals. Females get to vote in 1918 because of their service in World War I. And then the Great Depression hits in 1929, and Britain decides to pull together in 1931 and create not a popular front government, but a national government of all the parties together. They put aside their squabbling over left and right, and they tried to deal with the Great Depression. It hits Britain a little harder because they're an export economy, a pretty industrialized economy. But here's look at the look at the image, and this is kind of an oddly funny thing that happens, I think. Let me go back to my thesis about Britain in general. I can even do Russia first. What's Mr. Barron's thesis about Russia? Always behind. What's Mr. Barron's thesis?
It's terrible to live in.
Also, it's terrible to live in. But always behind, Bobby. Always behind. Trying to modernize, trying to westernize. What's Mr. Barron's thesis about Britain?
It was ahead, like it starts the stuff.
Yeah, it's always ahead. It starts the stuff. And the stuff is the Industrial Revolution. Or the stuff is liberalism, or the stuff is, more modern stuff. We're moving towards more democracy. Eventually we're moving towards more help for people. And so they tend to let men vote. Remember how they're letting the steam out? There's an 1832 Great Reform Bill, an 1867 Great Reform Bill, an 1885 Great Reform Bill. They're letting ladies vote. They're letting all of this democracy happen, going all the way back to 1688. What happens in 1688? Bobby, what happens in 1688?
Glorious Revolution.
That kid knows some crazy facts. Yeah, the Glorious Revolution, right? Con man. Or even if you want to go back to when they're chopping off the head of Charles I in the Civil War. Here's what they don't have. They don't seem to have crazy left-right movements that are popular. There are a smattering of communists in Britain for a long period of time. There's also, and this is kind of crazy and I love this, there is a smattering of fascism. There's this guy named Sir Oswald Mosley who creates the British Fascist Party, or British Union of Fascists. And they copy everything from Hitler and Mussolini. They do the salute, they do the black uniforms, they do the speeches. It's the whole deal. Fascism, far right, and communism, far left. Some people gravitate towards this, a few, but not very many. It's kind of like in the United States at this point in time. We have some fascists too. In fact, there's fascists in Minneapolis, anti-Semitic fascists in Minneapolis in the 1930s. Did you know that? Yeah, they're called the Silver Shirts. Yeah. Well, the Great Depression happens. They went from about 1 million unemployed people to 3 million unemployed people. A lot of those people were getting turned out of the factories. The government says, we're not taking in money anymore because people aren't working anymore. Therefore, we're busting our budget. We're going into debt. Let's cut how much money the government is getting out. Do we all understand why that's a really bad idea? Keynesian economics tells us to spend money in times of depression, to prime the pump, to get the economy going again, get people back to work, give them social welfare so they're spending their money and the factories will open up and all that kind of stuff. Well, they don't do that. They also dropped the gold standard in 1931. Everyone's currency used to be based on precious metal. In fact, it used to say that on our currency, it said this $10 is redeemable at a bank for $10 in silver, $10 in gold. Well, that's fine, I guess. There are still people who like that idea, but and I guess it gives your currency a value depending on what the value of gold or silver is. But they decided to drop that completely and just print as much money as they want to. Their currency will be devalued, and then maybe they can sell their products to people overseas. That's what they do. They also increase tariffs. You know why I do the exclamation? Britain's mostly a free trade kind of place. They don't want people having tariffs, but everybody around the world during the Great Depression is throwing up tariffs, throwing up barriers to trade. And well, they start to slowly improve their economy over time. They don't get too crazy about things like the Germans do or like the Americans do with Roosevelt's programs. The Brits tended to be rather isolationist. So every once in a while, Britain gets drawn into a European war, and then they kind of, after the war, they say, why did we jump in that war? Why are we doing the stuff that the crazy Europeans are doing? We have an English channel. We're an island. Why do we keep doing this? And in fact, if you think about it, why did Britain get involved in World War I? We sort of just went over one of the possibilities. Supporting neutral Belgium. That's a pretty weak idea. That's a pretty weak reason, though, right? Do you guys have a sense for why they really got into World War I? What is it? War is happier? Popular. War is popular. Yeah, that could be possible. War is popular.
Like power balance reasons.
Yeah. Who are they worried about?
Like the European countries, I guess.
But one in particular, right? If you look at the rise and fall of these powers, our first superpower that we talked about in this class, Spain. Our second superpower, France. And our third superpower, and our fourth superpower that doesn't get to be a superpower. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Look at things in 2021 and tell me who's running Europe. So they felt like they had gotten involved in this war to knock down Germany, but then Germany got knocked down. And then after the war, Germany's kind of a mess. They're not too worried about Germany. They will be soon enough. They're much more worried about Russia as a Soviet Union, the Bolshevik threat. Imagine if that spreads to everywhere else. Whoa. So they don't really want to go in and have alliances with anybody. They don't get drawn into another war. So they don't. They do, in the Treaty of Locarno, they say, look, if anybody violates these borders in Western Europe, we will be there. Maybe they would have, maybe they wouldn't. But they don't seem to want to get involved in war, as you'll see in the 1930s. They retain all of their pre-war colonies. They start to wring their hands about India. The Indians, over every single year, the Indians are getting more and more vocal about wanting to be independent of Britain. There is a guy by the name of Gandhi, and Gandhi is advocating. I think you guys know this. Advocating for non-violent resistance to British rule. And India, you don't think about this too much, but India really helped Britain out in World War I. Helped them out in World War II as well. With the understanding in both of those wars that they're going to get something out of this. You Indians help us and we'll, work on something after the war. The home rule for India, just like they gave up on Ireland. Boom. After the war, Ireland becomes a separate state. Like France, though, through the League of Nations, they got mandates. They got Iraq, they got Transjordan, they got Palestine. They probably didn't want Palestine once they figured out what was going on there, but they got a hold of those places and became responsible for running them. This is the beginning of, for Britain, getting involved in this Arab-Israeli conflict, where you've got Zionists who want to create an Israel and Palestinians who don't want that to happen, and eventually Palestinians who want their own country. And Britain has this problem has fallen into Britain's lap. In 1917, when they were making drunken promises to everyone about if you support us in the war, we'll help you out, they tell Zionists in Palestine that if they help them defeat the Ottomans, some good will happen. Eventually, they'll create a Jewish state there. That's the Balfour Declaration. Look, this is the leader of Britain. The guy. Wait, I can't remember. Do you guys know which one's the leader of Britain? Left or right? Anyway, the Joyless victors are plodding along, doing the same old from the late 19th century and early 20th century. Liberalism, capital versus labor, left versus right, and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, you've got fascist Italy, you've got Nazi Germany, and you've got this communist, I quote, air quotes, communist Soviet Union. Those are all totalitarian states that just seem so modern and energized, and the people are excited. And it seems like, in a crazy way, the people in those countries are unified. Whereas, Britain and France, you got that left-right divide in France, you got that capital versus labor thing going on in Britain. And what you'll see happening in the 1930s is that this guy on the right, Bobby, what's the guy on the right's name?
No clue. I can't.
He's the leader of Germany, I know that.
Oh, isn't that the first prime minister or whatever? Chamberlain?
Yeah, the guy on the left is Chamberlain, the guy on the right is Hitler. And Chamberlain is going to be so outmaneuvered, so outfoxed, and so duped by Hitler. And Hitler's just going to be, he's going to be doing his thing. Never believe Hitler. He's always lying to you. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the 1930s. Dynamic Germany versus plotting on. Now, what questions do you have for me? You know how those totalitarian states solve the worker problem, like in the DBQ? Government intervention in the economy, just in a way that they hadn't expected, I think. Cool. No questions from home?
How many lectures, or this is kind of rude for me to ask, but how many more lectures until we get to
Until we get to what?
World War II?
6. I'm just kind of making that up, but a few.
Oh yeah, wait, I can look on Schoology, right?
You could do that as well, yeah.
Oh yes, sir. Okay.
I think the lead up to World War II is sometimes more exciting, and then World War II is probably about 3 lectures.
3?
Yeah, I think so. You got a battlefront, a home front, you know, that kind of thing. All right, you go now. Have a nice weekend. I'll see you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.